You have an idea sitting in your head right now. Maybe it has been there for weeks, maybe longer. You know exactly what you want to do. You have thought about it in the shower, replayed it while driving, mapped parts of it out in your mind with a level of detail that would actually impress people if they knew. And yet, somehow, the thing still has not started. Not because you were lazy, you are one of the least lazy people you know. Not because you do not care, if anything, you care so much it almost feels like a problem. And not because the idea is bad. You know it is not bad. If it were bad, you probably would have started already. That is the strange irony sitting at the center of this video. The more capable someone is, the harder it often is for them to begin. And we have spent a very long time misunderstanding why. When someone watches a talented person avoid their own work, the easy explanation is fear. And that explanation is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that does the person a quiet disservice. We say things like, they're afraid of failure, or they're a perfectionist, as if those are character flaws that simply need correcting, as if the solution is just to lower your standards, push through the discomfort, and start anyway. But that framing assumes the problem is motivational, and in many cases, it is not. In many cases, what looks like avoidance from the outside is actually something far more interesting happening on the inside. This is not a video about how to be more productive. There are thousands of those. This is a video about understanding what is actually happening in the mind of someone who is deeply ambitious, genuinely capable, and still cannot bring themselves to begin. Because once you understand it, something shifts. Not immediately and not all at once, but something shifts. Act 1. The misunderstood pattern. Let us start with the stereotype, because it's worth naming clearly. The stereotype of the person who struggles to start looks like this. Someone sitting on the couch, scrolling, procrastinating, using busyness as an excuse, fundamentally afraid of hard work or judgment. The internet has a word for this now. It calls it self-sabotage. And while self-sabotage is a real thing, using it as a blanket explanation for ambitious people who stall before beginning is a little like calling a surgeon clumsy because they take longer to make their first incision than a butcher would. The surgeon is not being slow because they lack confidence. They are being slow because they understand what they are about to do. The reality is that many of the people who struggle the most to begin are the same people who, once they do begin, produce work of unusual quality. They are people with high internal standards, strong pattern recognition, and a deep sensitivity to the gap between what they envision and what currently exists on the page, the screen, or in the world. That gap is not imagined, it's real, and the brain knows it. Here's where psychology becomes useful, not as a diagnostic tool, but as a mirror. There's a concept in developmental psychology called the knowing-doing gap, and while researchers have applied it primarily to organizations and leadership, it maps almost perfectly onto the internal experience of the ambitious individual. You can know exactly what needs to happen and still be unable to initiate action. This is not a contradiction, it's a feature of sophisticated cognition. The more thoroughly you understand a complex task, the more your brain preloads all the possible failure points before you even begin. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition working exactly the way it is supposed to. The problem is that it can become its own obstacle. Think of it like this. Imagine you've walked a forest path once, quickly, without much attention. You'd probably walk it again without much hesitation. But now imagine you know that path deeply. You know where the roots cross the trail. You know the section where the ground gets soft after rain. You know the fork at the midpoint where people consistently get turned around. This time, before you step onto the path, your mind is already running through all of it. That is not weakness, that is knowledge. But it does mean that taking the first step feels heavier than it did when you knew less. This is what happens inside ambitious people when they face their work. They are not frozen because they don't know enough. They are frozen, in part, because they know too much about how much there is to know. Act 2. The deeper layer. But there's another layer here. And this one is a little more uncomfortable to sit with. The psychologist Carol Dweck spent years studying how people respond to the possibility of failure, and her research introduced a distinction that sounds simple but cuts quite deep. She identified two broad orientations, one where ability is treated as fixed and one where ability is treated as expandable. People with a fixed view of their own intelligence or talent are statistically far more likely to avoid situations where they might be proven wrong about themselves, not because they believe they cannot do it, but because doing it badly even once would threaten something much more important to them than the project itself. It would threaten their identity. And here's the thing about ambitious people specifically. Their ambition is not just about achieving outcomes. It's about being a certain kind of person, the kind that makes great things, who sees clearly, who gets it right. The work is not just work, it's evidence. Every project is, in some quiet way, an attempt to confirm something about who you are. And that means failing to begin is actually the safest option available, because a thing that has not started cannot yet prove you wrong about yourself. This is not a character flaw. It's a completely understandable response to caring deeply about your identity. The problem is that it creates a trap. The longer you wait, the more the unstarted thing accumulates psychological weight. It becomes symbolic. It starts to represent not just a project, but your potential itself. And potential, as long as it remains untested, stays perfect. The moment you begin, you trade perfect potential for imperfect reality. That's a real loss. Your nervous system feels it as a real loss, and it responds accordingly. The philosopher William James, writing in the late 19th century, noticed something similar when he observed that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes. What he was pointing toward, long before we had the neuroscience to explain it, was the fact that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are have a powerful, almost gravitational pull on our behavior. Not because we're weak-willed, but because coherence is one of the deepest drives the human mind has. We want our actions to match our self-image. When they threaten to diverge, we stall. Act 3. The brain's role explained gently. It helps to understand something about how the brain handles uncertainty, because ambitious people tend to carry a particularly high level of it. When you're about to begin a large or meaningful project, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, judgment, and imagining future outcomes, becomes very active. This is useful. It's what allows you to strategize, to anticipate problems, to think ahead. But it can run against initiation when it runs too far forward. The brain begins modeling not just the first step, but the 20th, and the possible failure at step 15, and what that failure would mean for how people perceive you, and whether the idea was ever really good to begin with, and around it goes. Meanwhile, the part of your brain that handles the actual execution of new behaviors, the basal ganglia, which loves routine and pattern, quietly waits for something familiar to latch onto. Familiar things feel safe. New things, even exciting new things, carry a low-grade sense of threat, not because they are dangerous, but because the brain cannot predict how they will go. And unpredictability, neurologically speaking, is treated with caution. So you have on one side an overly active planner running through futures that haven't happened yet, and on the other side, a habit system waiting for a green light that feels certain enough to act on. The ambitious person gets caught between these two. Their vision is vivid. Their execution system is waiting, and the gap between them is where the paralysis lives. This is sometimes called analysis paralysis in popular culture, which is an accurate name, but a slightly unfair one, because it implies the problem is that you're thinking too much. The real issue is not that you're thinking too much, it's that the thinking is happening without a clear signal to the body that it's time to move. The thought loops endlessly because it has not been given a first action specific enough to feel safe. What the research on habit formation and behavioral activation actually suggests is quite counterintuitive. The feeling of readiness typically does not precede action. It follows it. Motivation is not a cause. In many cases, it is an effect. You don't feel ready and then begin. You begin with whatever small readiness you have, and the feeling of engagement arrives somewhere in the middle of the first attempt. This is why writers often describe the act of getting to the desk as the hardest part, not the writing itself. Once the pen is moving, something else takes over. But the brain, in its cautious brilliance, keeps trying to feel ready before it lets you start.
Act 4. The invitation to look inward. I want to pause here for a moment, because this is the part of the conversation that matters most. If what has been described resonates with you, I want to gently ask something. And I want to be clear that this is not a diagnostic question or a challenge. It is just an honest invitation. What is the thing you have not started? And beneath the practical reasons you give for not starting it, what is the thing you are actually afraid of finding out about yourself? That is not a question that needs to be answered out loud or even consciously, but it is worth sitting near. Because the pattern we are talking about, ambitious people stalling before their most meaningful work, almost always has a personal center of gravity, something specific that the project represents, a belief about your intelligence, a hope about how your life could go, an identity you have been quietly building for years that has not yet been tested by reality. There is nothing wrong with any of that. Caring about who you are is not a pathology, but it becomes a quiet prison when the project you most want to create becomes primarily a referendum on your worth rather than simply a thing you are making. The writer Franz Kafka spent most of his adult life writing and rewriting, starting and abandoning, asking his friend Max Brod to burn his manuscripts after his death. Brod, of course, did not. The trial, the castle, the metamorphosis, all of it survived because a friend chose to preserve what Kafka could not bring himself to finish or release. We do not know exactly what was happening inside Kafka, but anyone who has read his letters knows he was not lacking in talent or intelligence. He was suffocating under the weight of what his work meant to him. The work was not just work, it was everything. And when something is everything, beginning feels catastrophic. That is an extreme example, but the internal logic is recognizable, is it not? Act 5. Healthy tension versus avoidance. It is worth drawing a distinction here with some care. Not all hesitation before meaningful work is avoidance. Some of it is genuine preparation. Some of it is the mind doing legitimate work before the hands begin. The poet Rilke spent years living quietly in European castles, supported by patrons, writing almost nothing, incubating. And then he wrote the Duino Elegies, widely regarded as one of the great achievements of 20th century poetry. Was that hesitation? Was that avoidance? Or was that a long, necessary silence before something that needed time to form? The difference between healthy incubation and avoidance that is costing you something real is not always obvious from the inside, but there are a few honest questions you can ask yourself. Does thinking about this project feel alive, or does it feel deadened? Is the delay accompanied by some quiet, ongoing engagement with the material, even if nothing is being produced yet? Or has the project become something you actively try not to think about because thinking about it has become painful? Are you waiting because something real is still forming, or are you waiting because beginning would require you to find out something about yourself that you are not sure you want to know? These are not easy questions. They are also not questions with objectively correct answers, but the quality of your attention to them tells you something. If you can sit with them with some curiosity rather than immediate defensiveness or deflection, that is itself a good sign. It means the self-awareness is still working, and self-awareness is the beginning of almost every real change. Act 6. A different way of seeing yourself. Here is a reframe that may be worth carrying with you. The struggle to start, when it comes from the place we have been describing, is not a sign of weakness. It is not laziness dressed up in philosophical clothing. It is, in its own strange way, a form of integrity. It is the part of you that refuses to be casual about things that matter to you. The part that would rather do nothing than do something half-heartedly. The part that holds the vision so clearly that it cannot accept a version that falls short without at least noticing the gap. That is nothing wrong with any of that. Caring about who you are is not a pathology, but it becomes a quiet prison when the project you most want to create becomes primarily a referendum on your worth, rather than simply a thing you are making. The Japanese have a concept called kaizen, which translates roughly as continuous small improvement. Its underlying philosophy is not that you should do less or expect less of yourself. It is that the unit of meaningful action is often far smaller than we think it needs to be. Not the whole project in one sitting, not the polished version on the first attempt, just the next honest, specific thing. One page, one sketch, one conversation, one decision made rather than deferred. This is not advice about lowering your standards. It is advice about locating your standards more accurately, because the ambitious person's standards are almost always attached to the outcome, to what the finished thing will be, rather than to the act of beginning itself. And that is a subtle but significant misplacement. If you can move your standard from the finished work to simply the quality of your attention in this moment, the weight of beginning becomes considerably lighter. You do not have to be brilliant today. You just have to be present today, and let what is brilliant in you show up in its own time, which it will, because it always has before.
So here's the thing I want to leave you with. Ambitious people do not struggle to start because something is wrong with them. They struggle to start because something is deeply right with them, and it has not yet found its proper relationship with imperfection. The vision is real. The capacity is real. The care is real. The only thing that needs adjusting is the belief that all of those things must be fully in place before the first word gets written, the first call gets made, the first line gets drawn. They do not. They just need to be real enough to take one honest step forward, knowing the step will be imperfect, knowing the path will require correction, and knowing that the version of you who finishes the thing will be someone slightly different from the version of you sitting here right now. That is not a threat. That is the whole point. You are not waiting because you are not ready. You are waiting because you are human, and you are working with a brain that was not designed for the kind of meaningful, self-directed, creative, and intellectual work that ambitious modern life demands of it. That brain needs a little help navigating the distance between vision and beginning. And understanding that distance, really understanding it, is the most useful help you can give it. If this video made you think about something you have been carrying quietly, or if you found yourself pausing somewhere in the middle of it to reflect on your own relationship with your most important unstarted work, I am glad. That pause is not wasted time. That is exactly the kind of self-awareness this channel exists to support. The questions this video raised about identity, about fear, about how we relate to our own potential do not stop here. The next videos continue from exactly this place, not with advice on how to be better, but with a deeper look at what it actually means to understand yourself, and in understanding yourself, to find a kind of freedom that productivity hacks have never quite been able to offer. Take your time, but not too much.